All right, let's dive deep into The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. We're going to unpack your notes on this book and see what we can find. The book's main idea is that habits are these invisible forces shaping our lives. But the good news is we can change them once we understand how they work.
Absolutely. And you've flagged some really interesting sections that show just how powerful habits can be. Like the story of Lisa. She quit smoking after a trip to Egypt, and it transformed her whole life.
What was it about Lisa's story that stood out to you?
It's the domino effect. It wasn't just willpower. She basically rewired her brain.
Yeah.
She replaced smoking with jogging, and then that new habit led to all these other positive changes, like her diet,
Mm-hmm.
her work, even her relationships. It shows that even small changes to our habits can have these huge ripple effects across our entire lives.
Wow, yeah. It really shows how interconnected our habits are. One change can set off a chain reaction. But I'm curious, you know, if those old neurological patterns are still in Lisa's brain, does that mean those old impulses are still there? Could she easily go back to smoking?
That's a great question. It gets at a key idea from the book. Habits never really disappear. They become encoded in our brains. There's a specific area of the brain called the basal ganglia. It's basically the habit center of our brain. It's where automatic behaviors get hardwired.
So it's like our brains are always making shortcuts, automating actions so we don't have to think about them all the time. But then why are some habits so hard to break? If those pathways are already there, shouldn't it be easy to just turn them off?
Well, it turns out that even though the old pathways are still there, we can override them by creating new, stronger pathways. Think of it like making a new trail through a forest. It takes effort to make that new path. But the more you use it, the more defined and accessible it becomes. Eventually, it overshadows the old, overgrown trail.
Okay, I like that analogy. It helps to visualize how those new habits take hold in the brain. But is this something we can consciously control? You also flagged a section about the military, which seems like a weird place to study habit formation.
Actually, the military is a fascinating case study for large-scale habit formation. Think about it. Soldiers are trained to respond automatically in high-pressure situations. Their lives depend on it. Duhigg tells a story about a major who used these same habit strategies to not only excel in his military career, but also to improve his personal life. He even used habit strategies to influence crowds.
Wait, so you're saying that even complex social dynamics like crowd behavior can be understood through the lens of habits?
Yeah. It comes down to this thing called the habit loop. It's a three-part cycle that governs how habits form and operate. First, you have a cue. It's some kind of trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode and start a behavior. Then you have a routine, which is the actual behavior itself, the action you do. And finally, there's a reward, which helps your brain decide if this particular loop is worth remembering for the future.
So it's like a feedback loop. The reward reinforces the connection between the cue and the routine. You also highlighted Eugene, the patient who lost his memory but could still form new habits. How does that fit in?
Eugene's case shows just how deeply ingrained habits are in our brains. Even though he couldn't remember things for very long, he was still able to learn new routines and follow them consistently. The book describes how he would eat breakfast several times in a row, triggered by the usual cues, even though he had no memory of having already eaten. This shows us that habits operate separately from our conscious memory. They're wired into those deeper brain structures like the basal ganglia.
Wow. So even without conscious thought or memory, those habitual patterns can still control our actions. It makes you realize just how much of our daily lives are actually driven by these subconscious routines. It makes me think about those lab rats that Duhigg talks about. They were running mazes.
Exactly. Researchers taught rats to run through a maze to get a reward. The interesting thing is, even after they intentionally broke the habit, it would come right back if the rat saw the reward again, even if the reward was in a different part of the maze.
So it's like those habits are never really gone. They're just sleeping, waiting for the right trigger to come back to life. This reminds me of Claude Hopkins, the ad man behind Pepsodent. You marked that section in your notes. What was it about his story that stood out to you?
Hopkins was a master at understanding and exploiting the habit loop. He didn't have all the scientific knowledge we have now, but he knew how to create cravings that made people want to use his products.
I remember reading about how he found success with Pepsodent toothpaste. Wasn't there something about a tingling sensation?
You got it. Back then, people weren't really in the habit of brushing their teeth. Hopkins needed to give them a reason to make it a daily routine, so he added ingredients to Pepsodent that created a tingling sensation in the mouth. This tingling became the reward, the satisfying feeling that made people crave brushing.
It's amazing how he connected a physical sensation to a desired outcome. It wasn't about having clean teeth, it was about the feeling of cleanliness. It makes you wonder how many of our own habits are driven by similar cravings that we don't even realize. I know you highlighted Tony Dungy, the football coach, as someone who used habit change to be successful. What was so interesting about his approach?
Dungy's story is a great example of how understanding habits can get you remarkable results, even in high-pressure situations like professional football. He transformed the Tampa Bay Buccaneers from a losing team to champions by focusing on habit change.
How did he do that?
Well, instead of teaching players complex strategies that they had to think a lot about under pressure, he simplified their decision-making processes. He broke down complex plays into a series of cues and automatic responses. Basically, he turned their reactions into habits.
So by the time they were on the field, they were operating more on instinct than conscious thought.
Exactly. And it worked. Dungy led the Buccaneers to their first Super Bowl win. It proves that even in a field as unpredictable as football, habits can be a powerful tool for success. It makes me think about how we can use this in our own lives. What if we could train ourselves to be calmer and more focused in stressful situations by developing habitual responses?
That's a great point. Instead of reacting without thinking, we could train ourselves to respond in ways that align with our values and goals. I know you also marked the section on Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. They seem to be pretty good at helping people break bad habits.
AA is a great example of how understanding the habit loop can be used to replace harmful routines with healthy ones. They don't focus on getting rid of the cues and rewards that are associated with drinking. Instead, they help people replace the drinking routine with something else, going to meetings, sharing their stories,
Yeah.
supporting each other. These new routines become the replacement for the old habit.
That makes sense. It's about redirecting those ingrained pathways in the brain, rather than trying to erase them completely. And the feeling of community and support must be really helpful too. But what about people struggling with habits that aren't addictions? You pointed out the story of Mandy, the nail biter. What can we learn from her experience?
Mandy's story gives some practical strategies for anyone trying to break a bad habit. She used something called habit reversal training. It has 3 steps. First, she became super aware of the thing that triggered her nail biting. For her, it was a feeling of tension in her fingertips.
Okay, so she found the trigger. What's next?
Then she came up with another way to respond whenever she felt that tension. Sometimes she would put her hands in her pockets,
Hmm.
or she would hold a pencil. And finally, she found a new reward to replace the satisfaction of biting her nails. She'd rub her arm or find another way to stimulate herself physically.
So it's about disrupting the entire habit loop, not just trying to stop the behavior. It seems much more effective. I know you were also really interested in the story of Paul O'Neill, the CEO of Alcoa, who changed the company by focusing on something that didn't seem related to making money, worker safety.
O'Neill's story is a perfect example of the power of keystone habits. Small changes that create a ripple effect, leading to big changes. He didn't start by trying to make more money or be more productive. His only goal was worker safety.
Wait, are you saying that by making safety the priority, he accidentally improved other parts of the business?
That's exactly what happened. He created a culture where everyone cared about safety. They were always looking for ways to improve procedures and prevent accidents. And this focus on safety led to better communication, collaboration, and problem solving, which ultimately led to increased efficiency and higher profits.
That's amazing. It's like one positive habit sets off a chain reaction, leading to unexpected benefits in other areas. It makes me think of Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer. You highlighted a part about his intense mental rehearsal routine, including something called the videotape technique.
Phelps wasn't just physically gifted. He also cultivated mental habits. His coach, Bob Bowman, instilled a set of keystone habits in him, and mental rehearsal was key. The videotape technique involved mentally rehearsing his races in detail, including visualizing potential setbacks and how he would overcome them.
So it wasn't just about visualizing success, it was about preparing for challenges and developing mental resilience.
Yeah.
That's a powerful way to train your mind. Like he was programming himself to win by creating a mental habit of winning. It makes me think about how we can use this ourselves. Like, what if we use mental rehearsal to get ready for presentations or difficult conversations?
I love that.
Speaking of training for success, you also marked the section about Starbucks and their approach to customer service.
Yeah.
What I found striking was how Starbucks doesn't just hope for good customer service. They train their employees to develop willpower as a habit.
They realized that willpower is really important for providing consistently good customer service, especially when you're dealing with difficult customers. They created a training program that teaches employees how to control their emotions and build willpower in tough situations.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, there's a story about Travis, a Starbucks employee who had trouble handling difficult customers. Through the Starbucks training program, he learned to use a specific set of techniques, basically a willpower habit loop, to manage his emotions and respond calmly, even when he was dealing with rude or demanding customers.
So instead of relying on willpower, which can run out, they gave their employees tools and techniques. Basically, they created a habit of willpower.
Right.
That's impressive. If Starbucks can train their employees to have willpower, can we train ourselves to be more disciplined and resilient when we face challenges?
That's a great question, and it brings us to another fascinating thing that the book explores, the power of belief and how it can affect our habits.
This is interesting. You also marked a section about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. What was it about that event that stood out in relation to habits?
The bus boycott is a great example of how social habits, those patterns of behavior that spread through communities, can lead to massive change.
So it wasn't just about Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat.
Right. Her refusal was the spark. But the boycott worked because of the habits of the Black community in Montgomery. They had habits of supporting each other, of working together for a shared goal. And those habits, combined with a shared belief that segregation was wrong, fueled the movement.
It makes you realize how individual habits, when combined with a strong shared belief, can start social movements and lead to big changes. We've been talking a lot about positive habit change, but you also marked a section about Angie Bachman and her struggle with gambling. What was it about her story that you connected with?
Angie's story reminds us that habits can be good and bad. They can help us, but they can also lead us down destructive paths, especially when it comes to addiction. Her story shows that even when we know the risks, deeply ingrained habits can override our logical thinking and cause us to make harmful choices.
It makes me think about the whole free will versus determinism debate. If our habits
Especially addictions.
can control our behavior so much, does that mean we have less control over our choices than we think?
That's a complex question, and it brings up the ethical and legal implications of understanding habits when it comes to crime.
I'm curious to hear more about this. It seems like understanding the power of habit raises important questions about how we deal with things like addiction and the justice system.
You got it. And that's something to consider as we move into part 2.
All right. Sounds good.
Yeah, it's a really tricky area. I mean, on the one hand, we know that habits can have a powerful influence on our behavior. But on the other hand, we also have a sense of personal responsibility. It raises all sorts of questions about how we hold people accountable for their actions if their habits are driving their behavior.
That's a really interesting point. It makes you wonder how we can balance those two perspectives. The understanding that habits can be so powerful and the need for accountability. Maybe it requires a more nuanced approach, one that takes both individual responsibility and the influence of habits into consideration.
Definitely. And it's not just about the legal system. It also has implications for how we approach things like education.
How so?
Well, if we can understand how habits work, we can use that knowledge to help people develop better habits from a young age.
Like instilling good study habits.
Exactly. Or healthy eating habits, or even habits that promote social and emotional well-being.
Right. It's like giving people the tools they need to build a foundation for success.
Yeah. And it's not just about kids either. Adults can benefit from understanding how habits work too.
Absolutely. I mean, we're all creatures of habit, whether we realize it or not. So the more we understand about how they work, the better equipped we are to make positive changes in our lives.
For sure. And that brings us back to Duhigg's framework for habit change.
You mean the 4 laws of behavior change?
Yeah. He lays out a really practical approach for breaking bad habits and building new ones.
Right. Remind me what those 4 steps are again.
Okay, so first you have to identify the routine, the specific behavior you want to change. Then you experiment with rewards to figure out what's really driving the habit. Next, you isolate the cue, the trigger that sets the habit in motion. And finally, you have a plan, a strategy for disrupting the old habit and replacing it with the new one.
Okay. I remember now. It seems pretty straightforward, but I imagine it takes a lot of self-awareness and discipline to actually put it into practice.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
But that's where the power of understanding comes in. Once you know how habits work, you can start to see them everywhere in your life. And you can start to make conscious choices about which habits you want to keep and which ones you want to change.
So it's like shining a light on those unconscious patterns. Bring them into our awareness.
Exactly. And once you've done that, you can start to take control.
It's kind of like becoming the architect of your own life.
I like that.
So what are some specific strategies for putting Duhigg's framework into action? Like, let's say I want to break the habit of checking my phone first thing in the morning.
Okay, so first you would identify the routine,
Mm.
which is checking your phone. Then you would experiment with rewards. Maybe instead of reaching for your phone, you try meditating for 5 minutes,
Mm.
or reading a book, or spending some time talking to your family. The goal is to find something that gives you a sense of satisfaction or accomplishment that can replace the reward you were getting from checking your phone.
Right. So it's about finding a healthier way to start the day.
Exactly. Then you would isolate the cue. What triggers the urge to check your phone? Is it the sound of the alarm, the feeling of boredom, or maybe it's just the habit of reaching for your phone as soon as you wake up?
I guess for a lot of people, it's probably just a force of habit.
Probably.
So once you've identified the cue, what do you do?
Then you make a plan. Maybe you move your phone to a different room overnight, so it's not the first thing you see when you wake up. Or maybe you set a rule for yourself, like no phone for the first hour of the day.
It sounds like it takes a lot of conscious effort.
It does. But the more you practice, the easier it gets. And eventually, the new behavior becomes automatic.
So it's like we're rewiring our brains,
Exactly.
creating new neural pathways by repeating the desired behavior over and over again.
Right.
But what about willpower? I mean, it seems like a lot of this comes down to having enough willpower to stick to our plans.
Willpower is definitely important. But the good news is, it's like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Okay. So how do we train our willpower muscles?
One way is to start small.
Mm.
Don't try to change too many habits at once. Focus on one or two key habits and gradually build from there.
That makes sense. It's like starting with lighter weights at the gym
Exactly.
and then gradually increasing the weight as you get stronger.
Right. Another important thing is to be kind to yourself. You're going to slip up sometimes.
Mm.
Everyone does. The key is to not get discouraged. Just pick yourself up and start again.
It's like learning to ride a bike.
Yeah.
You're going to fall a few times, but eventually you'll get the hang of it.
Exactly.
So it's about persistence
It is.
and believing in yourself.
Yes.
Well, this has been a really enlightening conversation. I'm feeling much more optimistic about my ability to change my habits now.
That's great to hear. And remember, even small changes can make a big difference.
So it's not about being perfect.
No.
It's about progress.
Exactly.
Well, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll explore some more fascinating insights from The Power of Habit. All right, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into The Power of Habit. I'm really curious to hear what else Duhigg has to say about the role of belief in habit change.
It's fascinating, actually. He argues that belief is essential for lasting change, especially when it comes to those really ingrained habits, like addiction.
So it's not just about understanding the mechanics of the habit loop. It's about having faith in something bigger than yourself, something that can sustain you through those difficult moments.
Exactly. And he talks about how this belief can come from various sources. It could be religious faith, a strong sense of community, or even just a deep belief in your own ability to change.
It makes me think about those stories of people who overcame incredible odds, people who were able to break free from addiction or achieve seemingly impossible goals. It seems like belief played a huge role in their success.
It definitely did. Belief gives you that extra push, that resilience to keep going even when things get tough.
Right. It's like having that inner voice telling you that you can do it,
Yeah.
even when you doubt yourself. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating exploration of the power of habit. I feel like I've learned so much about how habits work and how we can use that knowledge to make positive changes in our lives.
Me too.
Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is that we're not slaves to our habits. We have the power to change them. But it takes effort, self-awareness, and a willingness to experiment.
And belief.
Yes, definitely belief.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
That's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those habit loops spinning in the right direction.